So we left off here yesterday talking about the modernization of Russia and the Ottoman Empire with decline and reform in the Ottoman Empire. And so the Ottomans had reached their height under Suleiman the Magnificent, sometimes called Suleiman the Lawgiver in the 1500s. But as the 18th century was approaching, they began to fall rapidly behind Europe in science, industrial skill, and military technology. And they were losing power. In 1816, the Ottomans had to give Serbia their own local autonomy. And then in 1830, just 14 years later, the Greeks won their independence from the Ottomans. And another threat to the empire came from within, the rise of Muhammad Ali, who was the Ottoman governor in Egypt. And his forces occupied Syria and then Iraq. And it looked like they were about to depose Ottoman Sultan Mahmud, not sure, the second. So he did survive, but only because the European powers intervened, and they preferred a weak, dependent Ottoman state rather than a strong one with a dynamic leader like Muhammad Ali. So in 1839, there were some liberal Ottoman statesmen who launched a series of reforms called the Tanzimat reforms. And the Tanzimat reforms basically called for equality before the law, a modernized administration and military, and religious freedom for Muslims, Christians, and Jews. But all of this failed to stop the growing nationalism among the Christians in the Balkans, and it failed to prevent Western imperialism from securing a stronghold on the Ottoman economy. And so equality before the law for all citizens and religious communities actually made matters worse, and it split the Muslims into secularists who were okay with the reforms and then religious conservatives who were not okay with these reforms. The Islamic conservatives hated this departure from Islamic tradition put forth by the Tanzimat reforms. So they threw their support to Sultan Abdul Hamid, and he completely abandoned this model of European liberalism and began a long and repressive reign. Well, this conservative tyranny eventually led to a resurgence of modernization among those Turkish exiles in Europe, and they were called the Young Turks. And eventually in 1908, they seized power in a revolution and forced the Sultan to implement these reforms. The responsive national state, 1871 to 1914. So European domestic politics had some common themes after 1871. And those themes were the emergence of mass politics and a growing mass loyalty toward the state. Ordinary people felt increasingly loyal to their governments, mainly because they could vote. Women's suffrage became popular during this time and actually made some gains. By 1913, women could vote in 12 of the Western United States. And in 1914, the year that World War I began, Norway also gave the vote to most women. Governments began to acquire greater legitimacy as they passed laws to alleviate general problems. And after 1871, governments figured out that they could manipulate national feeling to create unity, and thereby diverting attention away from underlying class conflicts, even using anti-liberal and militaristic policies. And of course, they did so at the expense of increasing international tensions, which would eventually lead to World War I. Some political leaders during this time built extreme nationalist movements by conjuring up animosity toward imaginary enemies. Number one, the Jews. Anti-Semitism after 1880 grew rapidly, and it really epitomized the most negative aspects of European nationalism. The German Empire. So the new German Empire, which at this point was a union of Prussia and 24 smaller states, They were led by a strong national government, and there was a chancellor and a popularly elected lower house called the Reichstag. And I'll put that up here. The Reichstag, that's an S. So Otto von Bismarck refused to be bound by a parliamentary majority, but he did want to maintain one, and he relied mainly on the liberals to help him have that. So the liberals supported legislation that would further unify the country economically and legally. And also the National Liberals supported Bismarck's attack on the Catholic Church, which was called Kulturkampf. And I need to make this smaller so I have room to write. The word Kulturkampf just means struggle for civilization. So the National Liberals supported this, and Kulturkampf was actually a response to Pope Pius IX's declaration of papal infallibility in 1870, basically saying that the Pope can do no wrong. He is pure of mistake. So only in Protestant Prussia did the Kulturkampf have much success, though, because Catholics throughout the country generally voted for the Catholic Center Party, and this blocked any national laws that were hostile to the church. So in 1878, since the Catholic Center Party was a great deal of people, Bismarck abandoned this attack on the church and instead sort of courted the Center Party by enacting high tariffs on grain, and this won over the Catholic Center and the Protestant Junkers, who had large land holdings. Many other governments actually followed Bismarck's lead in this too, and in the 1880s and 90s, they saw a return to protectionism in Europe, a return to high tariffs that would protect domestic goods. So Bismarck tried to stop socialism's growth in Germany. He did genuinely fear revolutionary language associated with socialism and allegiance to a movement that would transcend the nation state. But in an attempt to win the support of the working class people, Bismarck urged the Reichstag to take bold action and enact many state-supported social measures like accident insurance, health insurance, old age pensions, and retirement benefits. So he was thereby able to gain the support of the working class people, many of whom were socialists. In 1890, there was a new emperor, William. In the book, I think he's William. But William II actually forced Bismarck to resign, but he wasn't any more successful than Bismarck in getting workers to renounce socialism. Bismarck and the Kaiser had clashed over many things, which led to his dismissal. And he didn't really fire him. Again, he forced him to resign. But William was young. He was relatively inexperienced. His close relationship with Bismarck as a boy made Bismarck think that he could control William, which led to his resentment. And so William's advisors told him, if you want to be a great leader, you cannot have a dominant chancellor. And so really it was just a clash of views that brought on this resignation. So by 1912, the largest party in Germany was the Social Democratic Party. And this was shocking to the aristocrats and their wealthy conservative middle-class allies. But in reality, the quote-unquote revolutionary socialists were actually becoming less radical and instead began to concentrate on gradual social and political reform. Okay, so Republican France. So the Franco-Prussian War pretty much undid Napoleon III's efforts to reduce conflict between classes. And in 1871, France was pretty much hopelessly divided once again. And so the conservatives and the monarchists in the National Assembly decided that they had no choice but to surrender Alsace and Lorraine to Germany. And this caused the patriotic Parisians to proclaim the Paris Commune. in March 1871, and this was basically a radical socialist and revolutionary government that ruled Paris for like 3 months, March through May of 1871. This was pretty much crushed by the National Assembly. The National Assembly at this time was led by Adolphe Thiers. That's an R. And so Thiers' destruction of the radical commune, with the army of course, and his other firm measures showed the provinces and the middle class that the Third Republic might be moderate and socially conservative. And so France retained the Republic, though it was sort of reluctantly. One of the stabilizing factors, though, of this Third Republic was that they did give France a firm foundation by legalizing trade unions, by pursuing a colonial empire, and by establishing free compulsory education. Compulsory education is when you have to go to school. Although these educational reforms of the 1880s disturbed French Catholics, many of them still rallied to the Republic in the 1890s. But an incident came up that renewed tensions between the church and state, and this was called the Dreyfus Affair. So in 1894, a guy named Alfred Dreyfus, who was a Jewish captain in the French army, was falsely accused and even convicted of treason. And this was an action that was, of course, supported by the anti-Semites and most of the Catholic establishment, and opposed by civil libertarians and the more radical Republicans. And so this led to a battle between the church and the state. And this eventually led to Dreyfus being declared innocent. And this revived Republican feeling against the church. And the result was pretty much a severing of all ties between the state and the Catholic Church after centuries of close relations. So we're actually going to leave off there, and we will pick up in the next video with Great Britain and Ireland.